And I want to welcome back everyone. It's exciting for me to be joined by one of the colleagues my sister had who she absolutely loved working with in the United States Senate, Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico. The senator, an avid outdoorsman and a fierce defender of access to public lands. His leadership has been vital in restraining the Trump administration's push to privatize our public lands. Senator, welcome to the Rural Progress Summit. Good to visit with you.
It's great to be with you, Joel, and I'm excited to be with all the people who are part of the summit.
You know, we have something in common. We really do. I love the outdoors, right to the fact that it can be 30 below and I'm still not in my house. I'm in my fish house. So I know exactly where your passions are. I really do, Senator. And I wish more people were like us.
Well, it keeps people grounded, and that's one of the things that actually allows for folks to come together around where I am, where I work, and get some things done. And so many of the American people are hungry for that sort of an approach.
The first pheasant I ever shot was on public lands. The last pheasant I shot last year was on public lands. So this whole notion that all of us who are advocating for public lands and public access to be used solely one way or another is wrong. I mean, public lands are used in so many ways.
100%. And that was really, I think, why the debate started in a place that totally fell flat with so many people across the country. We heard a couple of things consistently. One, that these are not your national parks. Don't worry, we're not selling your national parks. And the other was, these are a bunch of vacant lands. And, you know, to a Westerner, those vacant lands are the places you can actually run your bird dog off leash and carry a gun. And, you know, it's kind of like telling somebody from Iowa or North Dakota or Georgia, don't worry, we're just going to sell a few lands around your favorite deer stand because they're being underutilized. And so they just missed the argument completely.
That was a great way of putting it. Trust me, that's a way that got my attention, and we get a lot of my buddies' attention as well. You know, you've done a lot of work to advance federal policy for bison. And can you talk to us about why bison are so important?
You know, part of it's personal for me, just because I grew up on a cattle ranch, but I always had a fascination with bison. You know, I actually, when I was little, I was probably 5 or 6, tried to get my dad to convert over to bison. And it's something I've followed my entire life. But when I got elected in New Mexico, you can't work with the tribes in New Mexico and not also get a bunch of, you know, hundreds and thousands of years of additional layers to that. Things like just food sovereignty and the importance of sending the message that, you know, after the U.S. cavalry basically made bison functionally extinct, I think we have a responsibility today to work with our tribal communities to really bring back those central important pieces of food and culture and history that are important to those communities.
Well, I don't want you to judge me in a harsh way. I'm from the North Country, NDSU, where they've won a couple national championships, and we still call it bison. So
you and John Hoven, he corrects me all the time because I keep using an S instead of a Z.
You actually say it the way it's spelled. That's just going about it wrong. You know, New Mexico, been there many times. One of the most beautiful states in the union, and a state where, if you look at it, it has so many different personalities. And I think that's the beauty of public lands, is the fact that there are so many different personalities.
It's also why we were successful in having this stripped out of the budget reconciliation bill. And that's a really rare thing. I mean, that process is inherently partisan. There is a real reticence to take a stand against leadership or against committee chairs. And it took something as unifying as public lands to really pull a bipartisan coalition out of the Rocky Mountains that ended up stopping this thing. And it was because the breadth of people who cared from every state in the union was so strong. I mean, we had We had the RV industry and the outdoor recreation roundtable and all the hunting and fishing groups and Johnny Morris at Bass Pro penning letters. We had all these influencers that were successful at generating a mountain of calls into the Senate offices. I had dinner one night before the reconciliation votes last week, and I was having dinner with Angus King from Maine. Now, he doesn't have BLM land and he doesn't have Forest Service land in Maine, but the that was what was generating the calls. He said, I'm getting as many calls, if not more, on public lands as I am on rural hospitals and Medicaid cuts. It was that unifying.
Let me explain to you what's got me so nervous, though, how quickly some people can change. You know, I knew Doug Burgum. In fact, I met with him and tried to get him to run for governor as an independent. I really thought what he had done as a leader in North Dakota was something that was really going to take North Dakota into a place that we needed to be. He was a huge advocate for public lands. Really, I mean, the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It just he bought some land next to it and really focused on what he could do to strengthen the park. And they talked about and are putting a Theodore Roosevelt Museum there, which has been controversial. I haven't jumped up and down about, but my point is this: he got changed. I mean, he really did. Somewhere along the line, Donald Trump got to him. And now you hear him talking about selling off public lands. And
Right.
I don't know what happened, Senator. I don't, but I know what I see from the Department of the Interior I don't like.
Yeah, one of my concerns, and certainly when Governor Burgum was in front of my committee, he said a lot of things that made people believe that he had a deep conservation core. But I think in this administration, the reality is you've got a bunch of 20-somethings in the White House that are driving so much of this policy. And it takes an awful lot to be able to stand up to that from the viewpoint of anybody in the president's cabinet.
Let me ask you this. Where do you see it going? I mean, sometimes I get it brought up to my buddies that I push it too far, that no one in the world is ever going to sell or take away lands this close to that or the other. And I tell them, I say that's some of the most valuable of the public lands. In my home area, we drill for oil. I don't want to see a bunch of oil rigs when I'm in the Badlands. How do you see it going there to where we're even going to go so far that we have to have that fight?
I think it could easily have gone there this time. I mean, we were a handful of votes away from seeing much of our front country, which is also, that's the winter range in the West. That's where your antelope and your elk go in the winter months when they can't be up high. It's the land that is the recreational beating heart for so many of our rural gateway communities. I mean, they've built their and diversified their economies around having access to this open space, around having people be able to camp there with their families, with their RVs or tent camp or whatever. And so it was really a testament to the people who pushed back, but we were this close. And certainly Senator Lee did not give up on this effort because, he had a change of heart. He had to give up on this because the math said there are people on both sides of the aisle, and whether the amendment was going to be at 50 or at 60, we were going to win it because people raised their voices. And that's the lesson. You have to raise your voice, or people will do things that are not in your best interest.
I'm glad that we can have this conversation from a perspective of what people say when they call into my show, my radio show, because oftentimes I hear that public lands aren't managed well, and that really people don't go about making sure that they do stay the way they should stay, which of course I disagree with. But that being said, want to make sure that you get a chance to talk about the fire that you went through, because those things are things that people use and completely misinterpret what happened. And so, if you could, would you speak to that?
If you look at our federal lands, they do so much for so many different constituencies. And I love that we're pivoting to using the phrase public lands, because these lands don't belong to the federal government. There are federal agencies that are tasked with managing them for all of us. They are your lands, they're my lands, they're my kids' lands, they're my neighbors' lands. And that means that they have to do a lot of things for a lot of different people. I've seen public lands that are some of the most best managed lands of any landscapes in this country. And I've also seen places where we've made mistakes and we've done things that shouldn't be done. But I rarely come across people on any part of the political spectrum who have a direct relationship with those places, who've sat around a campfire with their closest friends or their family members, who would say, "Oh yeah, we should get rid of these lands, manage them better. Count me in. I'll be part of that process." Absolutely, but sell them off. And you know who they go to? They go to private equity or somebody who could build a big fancy second home. There was no requirements in this legislation to actually build housing that would serve the interest. Now that's a real issue, housing, but that's a separate issue. This was a solution looking for a problem.
When you look at the management of public lands, and I'm sorry to keep hopping on this, but that's still up to us as a nation when it comes to our national parks to fund it, to make sure that the people are there to manage it. Are we doing a good job of that?
As of today, the answer is no, because so many people took those early sort of semi-forced retirements. We're down in the Park Service, we're down in the Forest Service, we're down 2,000 firefighters at the front end of what's going to likely be a very difficult fire season. And so you can't, I mean, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you want to get rid of the public lands, then don't manage them well and then use that as a pretense. My solution would be we should all be involved in managing these public lands, and we should fund the managers so that they can do their job to the best of their ability.
So, as someone who is a real advocate and an outdoorsman yourself, when you look at all the different uses for these public lands, do you think the general public gets it? I mean, you mentioned RV, we've mentioned hunting. I mean, there are so many ways that you can enjoy, public lands, and you and I know they do it. It isn't like we've got to encourage people to do it, but do you think that there are people out there who get to vote on the policies you're talking about who really understand the uses of it?
I think when people began to really understand what was at stake in this debate is one of the nonprofits, the Wilderness Society, has a GIS shop. And so they put all the parameters from the bill into their GIS layers and they printed out a map. And they said, well, these are the lands that would be available. And then people got it. They saw their spot, the place that they mountain bike or the place that they camp or the place that they bird hunt. And suddenly it was up for sale. And that's when the phone lines really started to light up in the US Capitol.
So, how hard is it? Because back in my days in the state Senate, serving on Natural Resources Committee, I had Republicans who believed what I believed as a Democrat, and it wasn't. It was so bipartisan you wouldn't believe it, and usually it was in the area of hunters. I mean, that was the group that we had kind of formed and advocated for, but it didn't. It didn't hurt that we had the hikers, that we had the recreate. I mean, we had the whole wide group. It wasn't hard to motivate them. These were people not in the political process. They weren't people who got up in the morning and said, "Gee, hey, can I call a senator or a congressman?" But we could motivate them. I mean, how hard is it to make sure that the senator leads know there are people out there?
Well, I think people who care about the outdoors tend to be reluctant warriors. We'd rather be fishing or hunting or camping or doing all those things outside. Like you said at the beginning of this, like in the middle of winter, you're outside. It's where you you feel best and want to be. When they understand just what's at stake, and it's not political hyperbole and the usual back and forth, and no, this is go time and it's real. Boy, they got real motivated real fast. And like you said, it was from, one way I described it was we had everybody from bow hunters to bunny huggers. We had the complete political spectrum across the middle and both sides and the very ends. I mean, so many people cared about this. Once they were properly motivated, they were kind of unstoppable.
Senator, I don't want to misrepresent myself either. I was in a fish house most of those times when it was that cold. That cold out doesn't mean I didn't have to shovel around it. When you look at the different age groups that are involved in being in the outdoors, to me, there's a real connection. I now am a grandfather. On the weekends, my grandkids get in the fishing boat with me, and we go out there, we get after it a little bit. A 5-inch perch is just as exciting to them as a 23-inch walleye is to me, but they love doing it and they're learning it.
And, I've got to think, I wish we could do a better job as a complete society of making sure that every young person has that kind of opportunity. Because it rewires their brains in ways that these devices that, like the more time you spend on an iPad, I think some of the bigger challenges come along with that. But when you spend time back in nature, it sort of resets you really quickly. And every child would benefit from that. I always said we didn't need No Child Left Behind. We need No Child Left Inside. To really get to the greatest potential for our next generation.
I think of outdoors, and I think oftentimes of a legacy and how when someone describes it, it really hasn't changed. If somebody sits there and says, hey, look, I remember having lunch with my dad on this rock. You go out there, that rock's still there. I mean, there's something about just simply the photo that you can get in a time lapse. I mean, that to me is exciting, Senator.
Oh, 100%. And when I think about the impact of having that permanent landscape, I mean, in many cases, these public lands for Westerners are the sort of anvil on which our collective identities were forged. We're a reflection of that landscape. And so it sticks with people across the generations.
Senator, let me play devil's advocate a little bit. The world needs oil. There's oil on the edge of this national park or that national park. You're just going to see the oil rigs in an area that aren't going to be deep into the park. Why shouldn't we be able to drill?
Well, as someone who comes from the state, which, by the way, has overtaken North Dakota to become the second biggest producer of crude oil in the United States and the biggest producing country in the world, I think we can walk and chew gum. I think we can produce energy and we can still protect those special places. And we should always be looking to balance our energy production with protecting habitat and keeping vibrant wildlife populations at the same time.
Let me push back again. I'm sitting here in northern Minnesota trying to raise a herd of cattle. The wolves were reintroduced, and the next thing you know, I'm losing calves out of it. Your answer to that?
One, I just think wildlife has a place. There's a balance in that. We should be able to manage our wildlife species. But I wouldn't want my kids to grow up in a world where they could never hear the howl of a wolf. And I can tell you, I've had those camping trips in New Mexico where we hear wolves howl in the background, and it's a pretty grounding experience. At the same time, we should take care of our ranchers, make sure that we have good, smart agricultural policies and ways to compensate so that you reduce those conflicts. That's one of the things that this is not a zero-sum game. We've got to get creative about how you bring the temperature down and make sure that people can share a landscape. And when it's public land, there's an expectation by the public. They don't mind the fact that much of it is grazed, but they also want the wildlife to be on that landscape too.
Because a man and woman aren't involved, sometimes the forests get to a state where you have wildfires, and the next thing you know, you put other people at risk. Your thoughts on that?
We absolutely should do a better job managing our forests. Unfortunately, we made this giant investment in doing just that in the both the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And this administration has come along and frozen those funds in many cases and has depopulated the very people who do the management. That's not a recipe for success. We should manage our forests better, but that requires actually being dedicated to paying people to do that management on the ground. We need people on the ground in our watersheds and our forests.
And I was just throwing those out there as arguments that people make that you have to answer in the
Never heard
United
them
States
before.
Senate. Yeah, I bet. So let me throw one at you as somebody who's been smelling smoke most of my summer up here in the northern end. In Canada, there's a lot of wildfires going on. There are, and there's nothing they're going to do about them. It's happened for a couple summers now, and what it's done is it's nature's way of cleaning things up. When you go to some of those areas that 4 or 5 years ago, were on fire. Now what you see is a lot of new growth. I don't think people understand how some of this is just simply nature's way of doing what it does.
Yeah, in particular in fire adapted forests, right? In the Southwest, we have a lot of ponderosa pine. That's a forest type that evolved with fire every 5 to 10 years. And if you take that fire out for 50 years, then when it does burn, boy howdy, it's a lot worse. And so we've got to get back to where, I've seen horrible forest fires in my state in places where we haven't done enough management, where we've fire suppressed for decades. But I've also seen those places that have been managed back to allow for natural fire and how beneficial that can be. And so you really have to understand what kind of a landscape you're interacting with and the best management prescriptions to keep that land healthy.
Senator, when you look at some of what's happening out there with the wild game, there are things that have gone on that nature itself has done some things, but our deer population in the Dakotas is way down. It's way down. Some of that has been maybe managed in a way where I think there might be some regret on their part, too many deer permits, that type of a thing. But when it comes to sheer management, I think overall we've been pretty successful. I mean, your thoughts?
We have the North American model of wildlife conservation is over 100 years old now. It's still evolving, but it's one of the greatest success stories of wildlife in the world, because if you just rewind back to the turn of the between the 1800s and the 1900s, at the turn of the century, things like white-tailed deer were incredibly rare. Wild turkey was incredibly rare. Elk were completely gone in my state. Canada geese, if you could imagine that, were incredibly rare because we had unmanaged hunting of these species and market hunting. And we put a system together that is now the envy of the world. And while we have challenges in this place or that place, overall, our big game wildlife species and our migratory waterfowl and our upland birds, like, we have an incredible success story that as the citizens of this country, we should be very proud of.
If there's one thing that's changed in my life and others, it's that we don't get after it with the waterfowl anymore. Waterfowl hunters where I grew up, we all loved it. And maybe we just got lazy, taking the decoys out and all the work that went into it. But if you're a soybean farmer, if you're an edible bean farmer and you're on the edge of that slough, you wish there was more people controlling honkers, Canadian geese. That's part of the management tool as well. And I think people lose sight of that.
We've got to always remember that we have to recruit and mentor that next generation. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what tools you have if you don't have people who can use them.
The other thing I would add as well is, I'm seeing people use them in way different ways. I'm seeing people get out there, and I'm seeing hikers, I'm seeing bikers, I'm seeing just people walking, I'm seeing people go out and bird watch. I didn't see that when I was young, or else I didn't notice it. Maybe I just didn't notice it, and I was too busy doing what I do. But I think you're on such high ground when it comes to this argument, because there is such a diverse group of people that are out there utilizing this.
And it is bigger. There's just no question. All the data that we now have, we now track the outdoor economy, and it's $1 trillion economy. Like this is something that is sustainable and that puts money back into local communities every single year. We need to nurture that for all
Yeah.
those folks, from the bird watchers to the bird hunters.
You get challenged every day in your job to deal with the economy, to deal with what's going on. And both you and I know that that with some of the legislation that is being pushed and actually passed in the big beautiful bill, that what we're going to see is less money spent on getting out, getting after it. There's going to be less disposable money to camp. How do we fix that? Because tourism in your state is just as important or more than tourism in mine.
Well, I think one of the things we can do is we can compensate at the state level, and I think it's really important for states to focus on standing up offices of outdoor recreation, also focusing on that next generation. We have an exciting program in New Mexico that gives out grants to connect kids to outdoor spaces. And I worked on a national monument outside of Las Cruces called the Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument. Well, there are a lot. We realized there were a lot of elementary school kids. Those are their mountains, and they'd never been there. And so, really focusing on connecting the next generation to those places, that will bear dividends for decades to come.
Senator, half the fun of visiting with you here is the fact that I'm going to get to tell Heidi I got to and she didn't. The next time we play pinochle, which, by the way, be careful of that. She cheats. I'm just telling you. But I do want
Give
to
her
thank
my
you.
best. I certainly miss her here. She's one of the most amazing people I've ever worked with.
Yeah, we're pretty proud to have her in the family. I do want to thank you for joining us today. I'm now going to hand it off. We're going to get a chance to visit with some folks that love the outdoors as much as you and I do. I know how busy you are, Senator. So thanks for joining us here on the Rural Progress Summit.
My pleasure, Joel.
Yep, you come to North Dakota, I'll take you fishing.
Hey, now we're talking.
Okay.